Back when I was 20, the summer before my senior year of college, I got an internship at a financial services firm downtown. It wasn't some impressive Wall Street thing. Most days it was data entry, spreadsheets, and staring at a monitor until my eyes felt dry. But the pay was decent for a college kid, and it looked good on a resume, so I didn't complain. There were 7 other interns in my group. They sat behind me in this open office area where the cubicles were lined up in rows. The walls were just high enough that you weren't fully on display, but low enough that people could lean over and talk to you whenever they felt like it. It was the kind of setup where you could make small talk if you wanted, or keep your head down and pretend you were too busy. Out of the 7 other interns, 5 of them were people I genuinely liked. Just normal college students, laid back, polite, not treating the internship like it was their entire future. Then there was this one guy, Eric, who acted like every spreadsheet was a final exam. He barely spoke, and he typed like he was angry at his keyboard. But the last intern, Alex, was different in a way I still have trouble explaining. When I first met him, he seemed fine. Maybe a little awkward, but everyone was at the start. He was tall and skinny, pale, with dark hair that always looked like it needed washing. He didn't really match the typical finance intern look, but honestly, I didn't care about that. What threw me off was how he acted toward me specifically. At first, it was small. During the day, I'd be working and I'd suddenly notice someone hovering at the edge of my cubicle. Because the walls were low, Alex could lean over and his head and shoulders would just appear above the divider, making him look even taller than he already was. He'd tilt his head slightly and hold this stiff, stretched smile, like he was trying to freeze his face in a creepy expression on purpose. Then he'd start talking in this deliberate, put-on voice, like he was auditioning for a role in a low-budget horror movie. I'd do this awkward little laugh and act like it was a joke. I wanted to assume he was just being weird to break the ice. It was an internship. People did awkward stuff, and I didn't want to be the guy making it a thing. He'd say random, pointless lines in that slow, unnatural tone. One I remember clearly was him doing this fake work joke thing and drawing out my name in the middle of it, like he was savoring the reaction. And the worst part wasn't even what he said. It was how he'd keep the grin there way too long afterward, just staring at me like he was waiting for applause. The first couple times I wrote it off as him trying too hard. Some people think being strange makes them memorable. I figured he'd settle in and act normal once he got comfortable. He didn't. Instead, it became routine. Every single day, at least once, I'd see his head slowly rise above the cubicle wall like a bad pop-up ad I couldn't close. Same forced smile, same tilted head, same creepy voice. And the conversations never flowed like a normal person talking. He'd toss out weird jokes that didn't land, or mutter phrases that didn't connect to anything happening around us. It always felt like he was performing, but only for me. The other interns noticed him too. I'd catch them smirking or giving each other looks when he did it. A lot of them seemed to assume Alex was just being an oddball to lighten the mood. I think they also thought Alex and I had some kind of inside joke, like we'd clicked in a way they hadn't. But that wasn't it at all. There was something about the fact that he aimed it at me over and over that made it uncomfortable. I wasn't especially friendly with him. I didn't joke around with him more than anyone else. I didn't encourage it. If anything, I tried to keep my responses short so he'd go away. And as the weeks passed, his little cubicle drop-ins got longer. At first, it was a quick comment, and he'd move on. Later, he'd lean over and just stay there, minutes at a time. Sometimes he would talk. Sometimes he'd barely say anything at all, just watch me while I pretended to work. I'd keep clicking through tabs and typing, trying to look busy, hoping he'd take the hint. He almost never did. The voice he used was hard to describe without sounding dramatic, but it reminded me of that kind of soft, taunting performance some actors do when they're playing someone disturbed, like it was meant to make your skin crawl. It didn't sound like his real voice. It sounded like he was wearing a mask. Then, about 6 weeks into the internship, something happened that made it stop feeling like workplace awkwardness. It was a weeknight. I was at home eating dinner when my phone rang. The number wasn't saved. I usually ignore unknown calls, but I was expecting a delivery confirmation around that time, so I answered. I said hello, and for a few seconds, there was nothing, just dead silence. No background noise, no breathing, nothing. I remember holding the phone away from my ear for a second and looking at it, thinking maybe the call had glitched. Then a voice came through, and I recognized it immediately. It was Alex, using that same forced, creepy tone he used in the office. He said something that sounded like a riddle, like he was warning me about the ocean coming up and needing to pull a boat out before it was too late. Only this time it wasn't quiet and playful. It was louder, almost shouted, and he dragged the words out like he was reciting a line he'd practiced. And then he laughed. Not a normal laugh, not even a fake, awkward laugh. It was loud and wild and unhinged, like he was losing it. Before I could say anything, he hung up. The part that made my stomach drop wasn't just that he called. It was that I had never given Alex my number. Not once. Not casually. Not through a group chat. Not on a form I remembered. Nothing. My first reaction was to text the number back and ask if it was him, but the message didn't go through. It showed as undeliverable. I looked the number up and realized it was a landline. That's when the fear really settled in. I tried to talk myself down. Maybe he found my number through the company. Maybe there was some contact list somewhere. Maybe he asked someone. But even if that was true, why call me at home, at night, and talk like that? Why that weird line? And why that laugh? It didn't feel like someone messing around anymore. It felt targeted, like he wanted me to feel uneasy, and he knew exactly how. That weekend, I barely slept. I kept replaying the sound of his laughter in my head. It didn't sound like a joke. It sounded like someone enjoying the fact that they were getting under your skin. That Monday, I walked into the office and immediately noticed Alex wasn't there. His desk was empty. His computer wasn't on. I didn't see him all morning. Eventually, I went to our supervisor, Martin, and I asked him as casually as I could if interns had access to company contact information. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I also needed an answer. I asked him if it would have been possible for Alex to get my phone number through the office. Martin looked genuinely confused. He told me interns didn't have access to employee info like that. Not phone numbers, not addresses, nothing. Then he added something else that made me pause. He said Alex wasn't coming back. He'd been let go at the end of the previous week. Apparently, Alex hadn't been doing any work and had ignored multiple warnings. Martin said it like it was no big deal, like Alex was just another intern who couldn't get it together. That's when I told him about the call. Martin looked surprised, and while I was explaining it, a couple of the other interns overheard. Their reactions changed fast. Instead of laughing like they usually did when Alex hovered around, a couple of them started nodding and quietly admitting they'd always thought he was off. One of them said Alex had made them uncomfortable too, just in a different way. I told them about the daily cubicle visits, the weird voice, the staring, the phone call, everything. The more I said out loud, the worse it sounded. Martin told me not to worry. Alex was gone. And there was no reason he'd come back. He said if anything else happened, I should tell him right away. That did help a little. At least I knew Alex wasn't going to be in the office anymore, popping up behind my cubicle like a ghost. For the next week or so, I stayed on edge anyway. I kept expecting another call, or a message, or to turn a corner downtown and see him standing there. But nothing happened. The office felt normal again. I started to convince myself it was over and that maybe Alex had just been some socially broken guy who didn't know how to behave. Then came the morning that I still think about sometimes, years later. It was a Friday, really early, around 5 a.m. Outside was still dark, but there was that faint gray light starting to creep in, the kind that makes everything look flat and cold. I woke up because I thought I heard something. I couldn't even tell you what it was. Maybe a sound outside, maybe my brain pulling me out of sleep for no reason. But once I was awake, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I got out of bed and walked to the window. I wish I hadn't. In my backyard, between the tree line and the glow from my porch light, there was a figure standing still and looking up toward my window. Even with the low light, I knew who it was right away. The thin frame, the messy dark hair, the way he stood unnaturally straight, like he was posing. It was Alex. For a few seconds, my body didn't even react properly. I just stood there staring, trying to force my brain to come up with another explanation. Like maybe it was someone who looked like him, like maybe I was still half asleep. Then he called out my name. He used that same performative, drawn-out voice he always used at work, stretching it into this sing-song sound that instantly made my skin go tight. Hearing it outside my house in the dark was like hearing someone use an inside joke in the wrong place. Except this wasn't funny. It was wrong. I grabbed my phone, my thumb already moving like I was on autopilot, ready to dial 911, and that's when Alex threw his head back and started laughing. It was the exact same kind of loud, hysterical laughter I'd heard on the phone. It didn't sound like a person trying to be funny. It sounded like someone completely detached, like he was enjoying something I couldn't understand. I shouted through the window that I was calling the police and that he needed to get off my property. I remember shaking the phone in the air so he could see it, like that would make it more real. He didn't panic. He didn't run. He just stood there for another second, still smiling, like he was deciding how he wanted to end it. Then he turned and started walking away toward the trees behind my house, still laughing as he went, until the darkness swallowed him. I called the police anyway. My voice sounded strange to me, too high, too fast. The dispatcher asked if he was still there. When I said he'd already left, she told me to call back if he returned, or if he tried to get inside. Basically, unless he broke in or directly threatened me, there wasn't much they could do. I never saw Alex again after that. Not at work, not around town, nowhere. The police couldn't do anything with what I had because technically, he hadn't done the one thing that would have made it real on paper. He hadn't forced entry. He hadn't said outright that he was going to hurt me. So it became one of those situations where you're left holding the fear by yourself, trying to live normally while your mind keeps replaying what you saw. The rest of that summer passed without anything else happening. I finished the internship, and on my last day, my boss pulled me aside and offered me a permanent job after graduation. At the time, I said yes, but even then, there was this small, persistent feeling in the back of my mind about that office, about how easily someone like Alex could blend in there for weeks, like a problem nobody wanted to deal with until it got too obvious to ignore. I never told them about what happened in my backyard. Alex was already gone, and no one knew where he'd ended up. It felt pointless. As more time passed, I tried to explain it away in the most logical way I could. I told myself he must have been dealing with something, some kind of mental illness, some disorder, something that made him act like that. It was the only explanation that kept my head from spiraling, because the alternative was harder to sit with. That a quiet, awkward intern had decided to fixate on me, found my number somehow, figured out where I lived, and stood outside my window at 5 in the morning, laughing like it was entertainment. It's been years now. I didn't even end up going back to that company after graduation. I took a different job somewhere else and moved on with my life. Most of the time, I don't think about it, but every now and then, usually late at night when I'm half awake, that image comes back. Alex standing in my backyard in the dim porch light, staring up at my window like he'd been there for a while. And I still catch myself wondering the same things. How he got my number, how he found my address, what he actually wanted that morning. Maybe it really is easy to dig up someone's information if you're determined enough. Maybe it was nothing more than obsession and instability. All I know is that for a few months in my life, I sat a few feet away from someone who wasn't just socially awkward or kind of weird. Something was going on under the surface with him. And no matter how much time passes, I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of his laughter out there in the dark. Like the whole thing was some private joke. and I was the only one who didn't understand it. I was 17 when this happened, and it was the first time in my life I ever felt unsafe in a place I'd always thought was harmless. It started with a job that seemed as normal as it gets, in a town where people leave their doors unlocked and everyone recognizes your last name. For a while, I honestly believed nothing like this could happen there. My first real job was at a small grocery store in our quiet Vermont town, the kind of place where the same customers came in on the same days, and the biggest incident was usually someone arguing about a coupon. At first, I liked it. The work was simple, and most of my coworkers were friendly enough that the shifts didn't feel endless. I fell into a routine pretty quickly with the cashiers and a few of the stock guys. During slow hours when there weren't many customers, the younger employees would drift toward the front registers and just talk. We'd stand there, half watching the doors, half killing time by discussing whatever show we were watching, laughing at the older employees who had their own weird habits, and complaining about rude customers. It was the only part of the shift where it didn't feel like I was glued to a screen, waiting for the next person to walk up with groceries. The vibe also depended a lot on who was supervising. If it was a younger shift lead, things were looser, people would check their phones, talk more, and nobody acted like standing near the front was a crime. If it was someone stricter, everyone stayed in their lanes and tried to look busy. There was one coworker I didn't really interact with much at first, a guy named Sean. He was 24, and he had this awkward energy like he never quite knew what was appropriate to say. His hair was longer, but in that in-between stage where it looked like he was trying to grow it out, and it hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. He worked dairy most of the time, so our paths didn't cross much. He was quiet and polite, and I didn't really have an opinion about him. Most people just gave him a nod in passing, and he'd do the same. Eventually, I got added to a coworker group chat. It was mostly for scheduling stuff, quick questions, and dumb jokes that went around between the younger employees. I didn't think anything of it because basically everyone my age at work was in there. Not long after that, Sean started messaging me directly. At first, it seemed harmless. He asked about my shifts, whether I was covering certain days, normal work stuff. But over the next few weeks, the messages shifted. He started trying to get personal, asking what kind of music I liked, what I did after work, what I did on weekends. At first, I brushed it off as regular small talk. People at work try to be friendly, and sometimes they don't have great social skills. But something about it felt wrong. The way he wrote didn't feel casual, it felt persistent, like he was trying to dig for information. And then he started making comments that crossed a line, calling me cute in a way that made my skin crawl, throwing in little flirty jokes that didn't land. I was 17. He was 24. That alone made it uncomfortable, and I don't think anyone else knew he was talking to me like that. I didn't know how to shut it down without making work weird, so I tried the easiest option. I stopped responding. I'd leave him on read, or just ignore the message entirely. That didn't stop him. If anything, it made him try harder. He'd comment on things I posted online, and sometimes the messages would come late at night. They weren't outright threats. Not at first, but there was this steady pressure to it, like he expected my attention and didn't accept silence as an answer. I didn't want drama at my first job, and I didn't want to feel like I had to explain it to managers, so I kept telling myself it was just awkward flirting. Nothing more. Then something happened that made me realize he was paying much closer attention than I thought. One night, I was at home in my room watching Stranger Things. It was my favorite show then, and honestly, it still is. I was catching up on the latest season, just binging episodes with the lights low, completely zoned out and relaxed. A couple days later at work, the younger employees were gathered near the front again, talking about TV. I was chatting with a few cashiers about some random series when Sean suddenly looked at me and brought up Stranger Things, like he already knew it was my show. I remember my body going cold for a second. I couldn't remember telling anyone at work that I'd been watching it. I just kind of nodded, acting normal, but inside my stomach dropped. It wasn't what he asked. It was how confident he sounded, like it wasn't a guess. I made eye contact with him for a moment, and he gave this small, awkward smile. Then he just walked back to the dairy section like nothing happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me in ways I hadn't noticed. Like he'd been paying attention for a while, and I was only now catching it. A few nights later, the fear stopped being theoretical. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep after a long shift. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear the refrigerator hum down the hall. I was half drifting off when I heard a soft scraping sound against my bedroom window. At first, I told myself it was wind, or a branch rubbing the glass. That's what you want it to be. But then I heard it again, and it sounded different, more deliberate. Like light tapping, just gentle enough that it made my nerves spike instead of comforting me. I sat up and listened, holding my breath, like that would make the sound clearer. Then it happened again. I got out of bed and moved to the window, keeping my steps quiet. I peeked through the blinds, expecting, against my will, to see Sean standing there. There was nothing. The yard looked empty. The night looked normal. No figure, no movement, no face staring back at me. I stood there for a while anyway, scanning the darkness until my eyes started playing tricks on me. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing, climbed back into bed and tried to sleep, but my brain wouldn't let it go. I kept thinking about that moment at work, him bringing up a show I hadn't told anyone about. The timing felt wrong. The window noise felt wrong. And even though I didn't see anyone outside, the unease stayed. A couple days later, Sean texted me again. This time, I didn't ignore it. I responded clearly and firmly and told him I wasn't interested and that he needed to stop. That's when everything escalated. He replied almost immediately with something along the lines of, "All right, but good luck moving," like it was a joke. Like he was implying he knew where I lived, and there was nothing I could do about it. My heart actually started pounding. It was one of those moments where your brain stops trying to rationalize, because he'd said the quiet part out loud. In one careless text, he basically confirmed what I'd been trying not to believe. I saved everything. I took screenshots of the messages right away. My hands were shaking so badly I almost messed it up. Then I went straight to my manager and told him what was happening. I explained the texts, the comments, the weird persistence, and the sound at my window. My manager looked shocked, like he couldn't imagine Sean doing that, but he didn't dismiss it. He told me not to worry and said they would handle it. I also went to the local police department with my dad. We filed a report, showed them the screenshots, and I explained the window incident and told them I suspected Sean might be stalking me. The next day at work, Sean got called into the boss's office. He didn't come back out to his shift. I found out he was fired right then and there, and the police started the process for a restraining order. On paper, it should have been the end of it. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't, because even with a restraining order, the fear doesn't just disappear. If someone is actually unstable, a piece of paper doesn't physically stop them from walking back onto your property. It doesn't stop them from sitting in a car down the street. It doesn't stop them from showing up when it's dark and quiet. For weeks after that, I became a completely different person at home. I checked locks over and over, even when I knew I'd already checked them. I stopped answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I refused to share my routines with anyone except my family. If someone asked what time I usually got off work, I'd brush it off. If someone asked what I was doing that weekend, I'd keep it vague. At night, I'd wake up convinced I heard something outside again. I'd lie there listening, staring at the ceiling, trying to decide if it was real or if I was just trapped in my own paranoia. I had to keep reminding myself the restraining order was legally binding. That he wasn't allowed near me, that he'd already gotten fired, that it was being handled. But fear doesn't care about logic. Eventually, as the weeks turned into months, the constant panic started to fade. Nothing else happened. No new messages, no unknown cars creeping by, no sudden appearances. The restraining order seemed to work, and slowly I found myself breathing normally again. I got comfortable going out alone. I stopped checking my window every night before bed. And after a long time, I stopped thinking about Sean constantly. It still took a while for me to feel truly safe again, though. Even once life looked normal on the outside, it left something behind in me. After that, I stayed hyper-aware of my surroundings. I was more cautious with new people, especially in situations where I felt isolated. I learned to trust that uncomfortable feeling early before it turns into something bigger, because looking back, the scariest part wasn't some dramatic moment where he tried to hurt me. It was how quickly it shifted, how someone who seemed quiet, awkward, even harmless, could turn into a source of real fear. How it can start with innocent messages, casual questions, little comments, and then suddenly you realize the person isn't just being weird. They're watching, they're collecting information, they're testing boundaries. Years later, I don't live there anymore. I work in a different town. I'm in a new apartment. I don't think about that grocery store in Vermont the way I used to, and I don't talk to a single coworker from that job now. But I still remember those nights lying in bed, frozen, convinced someone was outside my window. That feeling doesn't vanish completely. It becomes a quiet reminder that life can flip on you fast. Even in a small town where nothing ever seems to happen. And even though Sean never got close to physically hurting me, the mental damage was enough. It made me question how safe I really was at the time, and how easily it could have been worse. So if you're ever at work and you notice a coworker crossing a line, even subtly, don't brush it off as harmless awkwardness or just flirting. It might feel dramatic to take it seriously, but it can save you from months of fear or something worse. I did move on. I did get my life back. But sometimes I still think about how quietly it started and how fast it turned into something I'll never fully forget. When I was 26, I took a job at a small insurance office in a quiet part of Pennsylvania, and it's one of those places that still pops into my head whenever there's a storm at night. The office sat tucked behind a strip mall, nothing about it memorable from the outside. Inside, it was one long row of desks, cheap carpet, fluorescent lights that always seemed to buzz or flicker, and a constant stale smell of coffee like someone had been brewing it since the building was constructed. It wasn't a dream job, but it covered my bills, and most of the people were easy to work with. The work itself could get painfully dull. On slow days, the phones barely rang, and time moved in this slow, heavy way where you start counting minutes without meaning to. Most of the time I worked the day shift, and I was usually out the door at a normal hour. But on this particular Friday, I was scheduled to stay late and help close because we were behind on a batch of client files. It wasn't anything complicated, just sorting paperwork and getting everything where it needed to be so it wouldn't snowball into a bigger mess the next week. That afternoon, there was a major storm warning. The kind that dominates local news and makes the weather guy sound like he's trying to convince people to take it seriously for once. When I woke up that morning and looked outside, I could tell the whole day was going to be dark and ugly. The sky had that flat, bruised look, and the air felt heavy even before anything started. By around 3, the rain came down so hard it looked like a sheet. You couldn't see the end of the street through it. Thunder started not long after, close enough that it made the windows rattle every few minutes. I remember weirdly, I didn't mind it at first. There was something about the sound of rain against the building that made the boring office feel less sterile, like the storm gave it atmosphere. As the weather got worse, the manager decided to send most people home early. He didn't want anyone driving in it once it got really bad. Almost everyone left with this relieved energy, grabbing their bags and rushing out like kids being dismissed early from school. A couple of us offered to stay behind and finish the paperwork anyway. The only other person who actually stayed was a guy named Tom. He'd started working there about 2 weeks earlier. Early 30s, tall, quiet, and not exactly friendly in any obvious way. I wouldn't have called him outright creepy at the time. It was more like he gave off a feeling I couldn't name, like he was always nearby, always within your peripheral vision. Even in those first 2 weeks, I noticed little things. If I got up to pour a coffee, he'd end up at the coffee machine a minute or two later. If I went to grab printer paper, he'd drift over like he had the same idea. It was subtle, and I kept telling myself I was reading too much into it. Maybe he was just the kind of person who didn't know how to socialize and ended up hovering without realizing it. By 5 o'clock, the storm was fully settled in. Lightning flashed constantly, and the thunder that followed was so loud it made the floor feel like it had a pulse. The office felt wrong without the usual background noise of people. The steady hum of the lights was basically drowned out by the storm outside, and everything seemed dimmer even before the power started acting up. Tom was a few rows down at his desk typing. From where I sat, whatever was on his screen looked like random characters or nonsense, but I couldn't see it clearly. What I could see was him glancing over at me, not once or twice, but repeatedly. Every time I looked up, his eyes would be in my direction, and then he'd look away like he hadn't been staring. I tried to focus on my work. I kept telling myself it was nothing. It was late. There were only 2 of us in a building that already felt too quiet, and my brain was filling in gaps with anxiety because of the storm. But after a while, I realized something that bothered me. I hadn't seen Tom get up even once. No bathroom break, no walk to stretch, nothing. Just sitting there typing and looking over now and then. Around 6:30, the lights started to flicker. The first time it happened, both of us did that little nervous laugh people do when something unexpected happens, like the building is acknowledging the storm. I said something small, like how the power might go out soon, trying to make it feel normal. Tom didn't respond. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and then the power cut out completely. For a second, it was like the office got vacuum sealed. The computers went dead, the lights shut off, and all that was left was the sound of rain hammering the building. Then the emergency lighting kicked on, bathing the place in a weak orange glow that made everything look older and more cramped. I said something about how maybe this was a good sign to call it a night and head out before things got worse. Tom still didn't answer. Instead, I heard keys, the unmistakable jingle of keys in a hand. Then I heard the front door lock. My stomach tightened immediately. He muttered something about it not being safe to go outside right now. The words themselves weren't the issue. Any normal person might say the same thing during a severe storm. It was the way he said it. Flat and final, like he wasn't suggesting it, like he was deciding it. I tried to keep my face neutral. I told myself I'd just grab my bag and jacket and wait a few minutes, let the storm ease up, then leave. But the outage made the office feel smaller, like the building had shrunk around us. The emergency lights barely did their job. The hallways looked dim and oddly long, and the storm outside was so loud it felt like it was pressing against the walls. When I came back toward the front area, Tom was standing near the door, staring out into the parking lot. The rain was coming down so hard you could barely see past the glass. He didn't look at me. He just stood there like he was listening for something beyond the storm. I told him I was going to call my boyfriend quick and let him know I'd be home soon, mostly because I wanted someone to know I was still there. Tom didn't react. I walked to the break room and pulled out my phone. No signal, not even one bar. I tried again. Moving to another spot like that would help, but it was dead. I figured the storm had knocked something out. I tried the office landline next. Dead too. That's when the unease turned into real fear. Not because the phones were down, but because it suddenly felt like the building had been cut off from everything else. I turned around to head back out, and I almost jumped out of my skin. Tom was standing in the break room doorway. I hadn't heard his footsteps at all. In his hand was a small flashlight, and he was holding it under his chin like he knew exactly how it would make his face look. The upward shadows made his expression hard to read, and he had this half smile, like the whole thing amused him. I forced out a shaky laugh and told him he scared me, trying to keep the tone light even though my heart was racing. Then I asked him again to unlock the door so I could leave. He said something about it still not being safe, that it would be better to wait until the worst part of the storm passed. Again, the words sounded reasonable, but his calm didn't feel like concern. It felt like control. I said fine. I nodded like I agreed. Inside, I was calculating how fast I could get out of there. I went back toward my desk area, pretending I just needed to pack up. I kept my movements normal and slow, like I wasn't scared. My plan was to wait for a moment when he wasn't near the front, then head out during any lull and get to my car. After a few minutes, I looked up again, and Tom was gone. For a second, that actually made it worse, because now I didn't know where he was. I told myself maybe he went to the restroom, maybe he was checking something in another room, but I wasn't going to sit there and hope that was true. I decided to try the back door instead of the front. The back exit led to a smaller parking lot behind the building where my car was. If I could get out that way, I wouldn't have to deal with Tom at the front door at all. I reached the back door and grabbed the handle. It wouldn't move. I tried again, harder, nothing. Then I saw why. There was a chain looped through the hardware from the inside, secured with a padlock. It wasn't a normal thing we did. I'd never seen that door chained shut before, not once. My mouth went dry. I turned around, and down the hallway I saw the faint sweep of flashlight glow moving slowly. I didn't think. I just moved. There was a supply closet next to the break room. I slipped inside and pulled the door almost closed, leaving it just barely shut without a click. I crouched among cleaning supplies and boxes, trying to get my breathing under control, trying not to make a single sound. In the hallway, I heard footsteps, slow, unhurried, like he wasn't in a rush because he didn't need to be. Then I heard him say my name. His voice sounded gentle, like he was trying to reassure me, like he was concerned and just wanted to make sure I was okay. That made it even more terrifying because it felt rehearsed. I didn't answer. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I was convinced he could hear it through the door. The footsteps came closer, then past the closet. A thin strip of light appeared under the door as his flashlight swept by. I stayed frozen, staring at that sliver of light like it was a living thing. Then it slid away and disappeared. A crack of thunder hit so loud the building shook. The storm sounded even heavier for a moment, and I realized water was dripping somewhere nearby, like part of the roof above the break room had started leaking. I stayed in that closet, counting seconds in my head. Trying to decide what was smarter, waiting or running. It felt like forever, but it was probably around 10 minutes before I finally worked up the nerve to open the door just a little. The hallway looked empty. No footsteps, no flashlight beam. Nothing but the orange emergency glow and the sound of rain. I stepped out carefully, forcing myself not to sprint and draw attention. I moved toward the front of the office, telling myself I had to get out. I didn't care if I had to run through the rain. I didn't care if I had to drive home shaking. I just needed to be out of that building. When I turned the corner toward the front entrance, I stopped so abruptly my whole body went cold. The glass front door was shattered, not cracked, not chipped, completely blown out. Rain was blowing inside across the floor, soaking the carpet. Here in the wind pushed little waves of water toward the desks. The parking lot beyond the doorway was a dark blur of flashing lightning and pouring rain. Tom wasn't there. I hesitated for a split second, trying to understand what that meant. Had he gone outside? Had he done it and run? Was he waiting somewhere I couldn't see? But then something in me clicked, and I realized I didn't get a lot of chances like this. I ran. I bolted through the broken doorway into the rain and sprinted for my car, barely able to see, slipping on wet pavement. I didn't care that I was getting drenched. I didn't care that my shoes were soaked. All I could think about was getting behind a locked door that only I controlled. My hands were shaking so badly it took me a couple tries to get the key into the ignition. Once the engine turned over, I backed out fast and peeled out of the lot without ever looking behind me. When I finally got home, I locked everything. Deadbolts, chain locks, whatever we had. I sat in my living room, still shaking, watching the rain hit the windows like it was trying to break in. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The next morning, I called the office and told my manager what happened. At first, he didn't really believe me. I could hear it in his tone, like he thought I was exaggerating or panicking over a storm. Then he went there himself and saw the broken door. After that, he called the police. They showed up and took my statement when I came in. They said they'd look into it, but everything about it made it seem like Tom had just vanished. His car was still in the lot, unlocked. The keys were sitting right on the driver's seat, like he'd placed them there on purpose. His wallet, his phone, and a few personal items were still inside, like he had no intention of coming back to get them. And then there was the detail that made my blood run cold all over again. The security cameras had been turned off manually before the power outage, meaning it wasn't the storm that did it. Someone did it earlier. Tom had been there 2 weeks. He wasn't some random stranger off the street. He had time to learn the office, learn routines, figure out what to shut off and when. Nobody ever saw him again. Some of my coworkers said maybe he had some kind of breakdown, like he snapped and ran off into the storm. But I couldn't stop thinking about the locked door, the chained back exit, the dead phones. The way he held that flashlight under his face like he was enjoying it. I couldn't stop wondering what would have happened if the front door hadn't shattered when it did, or if I hadn't found that closet in time. I stayed at that job for about another month, trying to convince myself I could move past it. But I couldn't. Nothing else happened after that. Not to me anyway, but I couldn't sit in a small, enclosed office like that anymore, especially one where I'd felt trapped. Every time the lights flickered, every time the hallway looked too dim, every time the building got quiet, my body would go right back to that night. So I quit. And even now, whenever a storm rolls in and the thunder is close enough to rattle windows, I still think about that office behind the strip mall, and how quickly waiting out the weather turned into something I'm not sure I was ever supposed to walk away from.